Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Natural Capital Accounting Q&A, how companies like Monsanto, Natura, Novo Nordisk and Utilix are using natural capital accounting to drive sustainable decision making. My name is Victoria Knowles, and I look after the strategy, engagement and water groups here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome the presenters today, Richie Hardwick, Account Director at Trucost, Stephen Bullock, Head of Research at Trucost, and the additional panellists for the Q&A session, Julie Raynaud, Senior Analyst and Product Strategy Specialist at Trucost, and Alice Cyril, Analyst and Natural Capital Valuation Specialist at Trucost. After the presentations, we'll have about 20 minutes at the end where you can ask questions. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind you all that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Just type in your question and press send, and we'll wait until the end to answer as many as we can. Otherwise, if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, use the chat box on the right-hand side and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Without further delay, I'll pass over to Richie, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on natural capital accounting. As Victoria said, my name is Richie Hardwick. I'm an account director here at Trucost. For those of you unfamiliar with Trucost, we are an environmental research and business intelligence firm who specialise in natural capital accounting and valuation. So let's look at the agenda for this webinar. And by looking at it, it doesn't look like I've got control of the slides. Yes, I do. Excellent. First hurdle overcome. Wonderful. So for the next 40 minutes, we're going to talk around natural capital, which we define as the goods and services provided by nature and used by business, and share some ways that companies are valuing these services and in monetary terms and what they've learned by doing this. I think firstly it'll be quite important to set some context as to what we mean by the term natural capital and how we go about accounting for and valuing it. And then we'll go through some real-life case studies and examples which Stephen Bullock will take us through. Then the remaining time, as Victoria said, we can have some Q&A, and I would encourage everyone to put forward any questions they have, no matter how simple or how complex. I'm sure those colleagues of mine around the table will have a good go at answering them. So please do send through those questions. So without further delay, let's begin. So what do we mean by natural capital? At the most macro level, this diagram helps to frame it. Natural capital is the building block on which human well-being and all economic activity relies. A popular definition used by many in the space refers to natural capital as the elements of nature that produce value, that is both directly and indirectly, to people such as stocks of forests, rivers, minerals, oceans, land. These include the provision of market-priced aspects of nature, including things like aggregates, minerals, rare earth metals, and fossil fuels as well. As well as this, there's aspects that are undervalued, like water, or do not have any market value associated with them. These categories include many ecosystem services. To explain this concept, I heard one of my colleagues talking about this recently and used a quite good example to explain the idea of ecosystem services. Let's consider a forest. It provides timber, a commodity valued by the market. A forest also regulates water flows and filters water pollutants. Trees provide scenic vistas for the tourism industry and absorb air pollutants. Air pollution has a direct impact on people's health. A decline in health increases the need for medical services and thus raises the cost our society pays for healthcare. These are examples of services provided by nature and that are not valued by the market. Businesses generally don't pay a forest for clean water or clean air. Hopefully that example helps clarify what we're talking about when we look at undervalued ecosystem services. It certainly did for me. In this industrial age we live in, and our world of high technology, cloud computing, and the internet revolution, it is sometimes easy to forget what businesses have to rely on: nature to generate their profits. Scientists and academia have long been telling us that these services provided by nature are valuable. What if businesses had to pay for the cost of the services they get from nature? What if when looking at their portfolio or a new investment opportunity, they subtracted the cost of the environmental damage caused by businesses from their profits. Natural capital accounting and valuation gives nature's silent currency a value. This value is the damage cost borne by society outside of an existing market. Hopefully, the case studies further on will bring this concept to life. So from the previous slides, we've seen that society, human well-being, economic growth are all dependent on ecosystem services. However, what is also critical is understanding how we impact on those same stocks of natural capital. It is these impacts alongside our overuse that are degrading these ecosystems and the services they provide quicker than they can naturally restore themselves. In the analysis we typically undertake, we tend to look at and quantify impacts that include greenhouse gas emissions, water availability, air, land, water pollution, land use change and waste. We could spend time in the coming slides looking at each of the specific methodologies, but it will probably take up the remainder of the session. So I suggest if you have any questions around specific methodologies, how we come to derive these quantifications of values, please do ping us a question, let us know, or if it's more complex, then we can pick it up in a conversation offline. So we recognise that we are heavily dependent on undervalued or unvalued services provided by nature. We've also seen in that previous slide how we are impacting on those ecosystems and the services they provide. These dependencies impacts translate into global risks. From this slide you'll see the latest World Economic Forum risk report. Many of you may have seen it. It highlights the risks relating to natural capital and the environment, of which 5 of the top 8 global risks we face in the coming 10 years are in this category. I don't think you will be able to make it out in the top right hand corner, but included in that red ring are things like food security and agricultural challenges, the availability of clean water, and climate change related risks associated with rising greenhouse gas emissions. All of these are intrinsically related to natural capital. So, it's an old adage, and I think everyone on this call will have probably heard it before. What you manage, you can measure. Or what you measure, you can manage, to get it the right way around. And most organisations have definitely started this process. I thought it might be helpful to give a very brief overview of how we account for and value natural capital. Like many environmental reporting and sustainability assessments, it begins with understanding your value chain, setting the boundaries that make sense for that assessment. I think later on, when Steve goes through some of these examples, he will highlight different case studies where they've set different boundaries for different assessments, and I think that will bring to life a bit more on what part of the total value chain you might look at. Once those boundaries are set, we pull together the data. We use primary data where available, secondary data including academic studies and data sets to supplement available primary data, and thirdly, and this is importantly, we use environmentally extended input-output models and productivity models to fill any data gaps and complete the picture. This is necessary to provide a full assessment, and in lots of cases it tends to be a barrier for undertaking that piece of analysis because it was generating a full data set can be seen as too difficult or onerous. The next stage is important. We then quantify those impacts across the different regions and across the different categories in physical units. Those units will include tons, meters cubed, hectares, and then we move on to monetizing these and putting these impacts into a single business metric. That metric can be US dollars, euros, whatever business metric our client uses, so we can add those into the decision-making process. This monetizing evaluation uses regionally based valuation coefficients, which are supported and checked by an international academic advisory panel. The valuation produced is, as I mentioned earlier on, the damage cost borne by society relating to that impact. Let's have a quick look at why we might undertake a valuation. Valuing water. And let's take a look at this one. We're all aware that water is increasingly scarce in some geographies, and that this scarcity is rarely, if ever, reflected in the cost of the water. That is until there is an event around scarcity, lost industrial productivity. Seen lots of cases of that recently, or even civil unrest, for example. Some of those examples we've seen manifest themselves include the almost total depletion of the aquifers in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia recently announcing it's likely to stop all agricultural production and turn to a total net importer due to the depletion of its aquifers. Coca-Cola having to shut down production in water-scarce parts of India, given the conflict between providing clean water to society. Mine delays in South America, or closer to home, things like the hosepipe ban a few summers ago in this country, which I'm sure many of us remember. For this example, let's look at a reasonably modest-sized country like Spain and take the water used for a brewing business with sites in Cordoba and Bilbao. They both use 100,000 cubic meters of water. However, even though they operate in the same country, the scarcity of water is almost half as scarce in Bilbao as it is in Cordoba. So undertaking a natural capital accounting and valuation exercise allowed the brewing company to understand the true value of water utilised in different locations for the same output. Notice that the valuation for the site in Cordoba is over 3 times higher than the Bilbao, as the value of water is exponential to scarcity. Hopefully this example demonstrates why valuation is a key business decision-making aid. Again, if there's any further questions on methodologies, value coefficients, then please do ask my colleagues in the Q&A session. It might be helpful to outline the journey that natural capital accounting has gone through by utilising some first-hand experience. I'll go through this quite quickly, as I know we want to get on to looking at some of the examples and case studies relating to actual business applications. But at the turn of the millennium, there was scientific standardization of natural capital and quantifying the impacts. By the midpoint of the noughties, governments were pushing ahead on environmental reporting. We've seen an awful lot of work in that space in this country, with DEFRA leading on environmental reporting guidelines and standardization. By the end of the decade, investor interest in environmental risk valuation has become a lot more prevalent. People like the UNEP FI and UMPRI looking at valuing the damage, the environmental damage within pension funds. 3 years ago, the first full environmental profit and loss, EP&L, was generated. Puma raised the awareness and profile of full environmental natural capital accounting and also the value it has to business. And then last year, the first global perspective was on natural capital valuation with comparability across sectors and regions was developed. This report, I'm not sure if you've come across it, Natural Capital at Risk, the 100 top externalities of business, is hugely insightful and relevant to almost all businesses. It's well worth the read and can be downloaded from Trucost's website, or if you're having any difficulties, let me know, I'll send you over a copy of it. Which brings us to today, where we see it's not just the environmental pioneers that are developing natural capital accounts. It's becoming a critical business activity among many businesses. Finally, just to highlight, it's not just us on this journey. We track broader trends closely, and this chart shows just a sampling of the number and types of organisations involved. Investors have signed on to the PRI, as well as governments and environmental organisations. For mainstream businesses, the BSR consultancy reports that over 45 companies publicly disclosed on their efforts to value nature and better inform their business decisions. The other trend that we wanted to share with you are the steps that are underway by the Natural Capital Coalition. You'll see their logo in the bottom right-hand corner, who this year are looking to develop a standard for natural capital accounting, which will provide a common framework for all companies to use. The standards will be pilot tested in 2015, and we've already had over 15 companies expressing interest in this process. So, those slides have hopefully given a little bit of context and explanation around what natural capital is, shone a little bit of light on the process involved in accounting and valuing it, and hopefully set the scene on some of the trends that we're seeing in this space. For the next part, I will be talking much less, which you'll be pleased to hear, and we'll be hearing more from Steve and others in this room. But the next session is really where we're going to aim to bring natural capital accounting to life by running through some real-life examples, and in each case outline why the organisation undertook the natural capital accounting exercise, how we collectively went about it, us and the partner collectively together developing the solution, and how are they using the output. It's important to really focus in on how can you use the outputs of this analysis. It's at this stage that I welcome my colleague, Stephen Bullock, Head of Research here at Trucost, to join me. Steve will help guide us through the project examples. So we've broken the examples down into the three main drivers for this type of analysis. We'll start with those projects that are driven by a comms perspective. Please do remember to ping any questions across that relate to these projects or anything I've said previously. We'll come back to them once we've run through all the examples. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Richie. So the first case study is pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk, who recently published their first full environmental profit and loss account covering the 2011 financial year. The challenge for Novo was that they wanted to communicate environmental impacts in a way that is transparent and meaningful to both internal and external stakeholders. The result was that Novo was able to tally up all of its impacts and dependencies on nature and value it in monetary terms, on one page, in one table. The results of the EP&L are shown here. What this shows are all the different environmental impacts, water use, greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution in the columns going across the top for Novo's direct operations and its supply chain tiers, all the way through to raw material sourcing. The total value, €233 million, represents the company's total dependency on natural capital to produce its products. So how did we approach this analysis? Well, essentially there were 4 key steps as displayed here. In fact, this process is fairly standard across a number of the case studies we will be discussing today, and was also touched upon by Richie in the initial discussion. So step 1 was all about deciding or determining the scope and boundary of the analysis. Novo recognised that they had an extensive supply chain, and this was identified as a material part of the analysis, as were the impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and air pollution. However, we also identified land use as a potential issue that would be addressed in future analyses, as well as extending the study into the in-use or customer use phase of the life cycle. In step 2, quantifying impacts and data collection, this essentially involves engaging business units within Novo to collect data they were already collecting on their environmental impacts, and also identifying gaps that needed to be filled using other data sources. In this specific case, Novo were able to provide spend information for their suppliers, and also environmental data that they had been collecting with internal environmental management systems. But as with any engagement of this nature, collecting information from the supply chain is often the most challenging part. Trucost assisted Novo in this process by engaging with the supply chain using online data collection systems, and were able to shed light on and increase transparency further up the supply chain. That said, in some discrete instances, secondary data sources were required, including things like input-output modelling and life cycle assessment data sets. The third step, applying the valuation, should not be oversimplified. Trucost, over the last 12 years, has built up a library of environmental valuation coefficients for impacts at a global and local level. However, it's not just a simple case of identifying the impact and applying the valuation coefficient. What's also important is understanding the sensitivity in the results, and also ensuring that Novo felt comfortable communicating on something that often can be compromised with precision. So part of this process was also about consulting with Novo and explaining the methodologies and being transparent about how these numbers were generated, and also discussing the range and the sensitivity around certain assumptions. The fourth and final step is calculating the EP&L. This is where we bring everything together and calculate the EP&L statement, which has the monetary values reported alongside more traditional metrics. At this point, I'm going to pass back to Richie to talk about the value Novo obtained from the results.
Thank you, Steve. So I think with all these projects, it's important to understand, well, what can you use the analysis for? What are Novo Nordisk using this analysis for? And I've chosen 2 areas which in discussion with them, they've outlined as being the most valuable. The first is that it has allowed Novo Nordisk to compare impacts and identify hotspots across all operations and supply chain initiatives. They are using this analysis to focus their activities and investment in addressing those areas with the largest natural capital value. In this case, we presented it in euros. The other area that Novo Nordisk is focusing on is in using the outputs of the project to communicate to their stakeholders, from their staff, their customers, and importantly to their investors. In these communications, they're able to demonstrate that they have a complete picture of environmental risk and the scale of these risks and what it looks like in financial terms. The full report for the Novo Nordisk EP&L is available again to download for free on our website. So I would recommend, getting in there, having a look. Even to read the executive summary will show a lot more as to why Novo Nordisk went down this route and the value they derived from for undertaking the analysis. Pass you back over to Steve for the second example.
Thank you. So this next example is interesting because it illustrates how a company was able to use natural capital accounting to secure investments in its technology and communicate to its customers how its product outperformed. Utilix, a UK-based energy company, had developed a new technology for a decentralized energy system. The technology used wood waste to co-generate electricity and heat. The alternative was that energy would come from the UK electricity grid and the waste would go to a landfill site. It seemed intuitive that Utilix's solution was better, but they wanted to quantify the benefits in easy to understand business terms. The challenge was that all of the environmental benefits are measured in different ways. For example, tons of waste avoided, fewer gallons of water consumed, or fewer air pollutants emitted. The solution was to use a natural capital valuation framework so that each metric could be in the same unit and added together. The approach conducted was very similar to that of the EP&L. For example, we needed to define the appropriate scope and boundaries, we needed to quantify and value the environmental impacts, and then calculate the EP&L and the benefits generated. The key difference, however, is that this time we needed to select a baseline candidate, or the business as usual scenario that would be there if the new technology did not exist. This is a especially novel way of communicating about environmental impacts because there is a natural baseline or natural baseline candidate to compare to. And Richie will go on to discuss now some of the benefits that Utilix were able to derive from this innovative approach.
Thank you, Steve. So again, going back to the important question, how are Utilix using the analysis from this project? I think in this project the results for Utilix were quite dramatic. I don't think they expected them to be as high as they were. But using this life cycle based full cost accounting approach to incorporate natural capital costs, the benefits were a reduction of almost 1 million in pollution costs against the business as usual grid supplied electricity. This represented an overall natural capital saving of 30 to 40% against that grid supplied baseline for a single project in the UK. So they set out to use this to justify a financial business case, and that was exactly the primary way that they used the outputs. They used the information in their discussions with investors to secure capital and have also incorporated this information into its sales and marketing program. In addition, Utilix were able to quantify contingent liabilities and produce environmentally adjusted NPV for their energy assets, which has been used to inform the CapEx and OpEx decisions. So that brings to a close those two case studies. Questions seem to be pouring in now, which is great, so keep them coming. Lots of questions around comms and also other areas of natural capital. We'll move on now onto the second stage around risk as a driver for natural capital analysis. And again, we'll go through two examples here with the same structure of those that we've just used before. So I'll hand you back over to Steve to go through the first of these.
Thanks, Richie. In this example, luxury goods company LVMH were faced with a number of challenges that they wanted to address. The first challenge was to assess the geographical risk of its water dependency in relation to water scarcity across its own operations and its leather, grape and paper supply chains. The second challenge was to identify risk from increasing water costs in the assessed regions, taking into account the cost of the risk and its likelihood to occur. The first part of the solution involved the application of natural capital valuation in order to understand the true cost of water in key operational and sourcing locations. True cost peer-reviewed water valuation methodology calculates the total economic cost of water by considering, amongst other things, water scarcity. The results of this can be seen in the infographic on this slide. Here, LVMH's water footprint is scaled by water scarcity. The larger the bubbles, the more acute the issue. Next slide.
Right, moving on. There you go.
However, the analysis was really taken to the next level by combining the valuation with a regulatory risk index that assessed the likelihood of regulatory pressure resulting in increased water tariffs in each location. The output of this process can be seen in the risk management tool displayed on this slide. These locations in the top right-hand quadrant are locations with a high true cost of water and a high probability of that cost resulting in increased water tariffs. LVMH is using this tool to prioritise its risk management processes and to support the business case for increased investment in water stewardship programs in high-risk locations. This past year, the $3 billion Brazilian company Natura, in collaboration with Conservation International and Trucost, compared the environmental value of different agricultural practices for the production of palm oil. One approach to cultivate palm oil is in a monoculture, whereas another way is to use agroforestry, where the crop is integrated with trees, cacao and other crops such as passion fruit. This slide shows the results of the Natura study. The results show that the total environmental value provided by palm oil agroforestry is 3 times higher than that provided by monoculture over the typical 25-year lifetime of the plantation. In order to value the 2 types of agricultural systems, we developed a framework which quantified and valued the different types of ecosystem goods and services that nature provides. Ecosystem services included the provisioning services such as food, timber and fuel, and regulating services such as global climate and water cycle regulation. We also analysed agricultural-related environmental impacts such as GHG emissions from direct fuel consumption and water pollution from fertiliser and pesticide application. And again, I'm just going to hand back to Richie now to talk about some of the value derived from this study.
Thank you, Steve. So think about what the insights were for Natura in this case. The main one and the main insight and the feedback we took from Natura was that there is a win. There is a win by transitioning to agroforestry. There's financial cost savings from lower fertiliser costs and fuel use, and there's also environmental cost savings as well. So it can show that the two of them can work together. You have both environmental and financial savings, and the two complement themselves to build the bigger case for investment and change. There was another side benefit, I suppose, that came out of the project, and that's that the results also help the authorities to develop palm oil agroforestry systems with measures such as payment for ecosystem services scheme. So I think that takes us to the end of those examples. So let's now look at the third area of the case studies. This is around product development, and these examples relate to how companies are using natural capital valuations to support their product development. And straight back to Steve, you probably get the system we've got at the moment to introduce those, talk through the solution, and I'll come back with some of the outputs of the analysis.
The next example I'll share is with Interface, a global carpet tile manufacturer with about $1 billion in revenue and a recognised world leader in sustainable business practices. Interface wanted to know, what is the cost of natural capital in 1 square metre of floor tile, and how much do we rely on nature for this product? The answer is shown here for their European carpet tile, approximately $1.60 per square metre. This was calculated by applying natural capital valuations to existing life cycle assessments and environmental product declarations. As you can see here, the production phase accounts for 60% of the cost, and GHG emissions are the most significant impact across the life cycle.
Thank you, Steve. I think these two statements which Interface published really show what the outcomes of the project have allowed them to do. Interface saw that by monetising the product impact categories from their LCA studies, it would allow them to compare and prioritise which impacts they should focus on. Recognising that Interface are widely seen as a leader in this space, this was just the next step to build on a huge amount of work already undertaken in the area of product development. Another insight that Interface are utilising is how different environmental impacts of its products do not cost the same in different manufacturing locations. For instance, the cost of smog in the UK is far greater than the US, and these types of insights should be taken into account when locating future production plants. So these are really valuable insights that are being utilised by Interface in their continuing journey to be net positive impacting by 2020. So it's back to Steve for the last time. One final request to keep the questions coming, guys. We already received some great ones, but the more the merrier. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you. So the final case study. In 2011, sports lifestyle company Puma released the world's first environmental profit and loss account, which many of you may have heard of. It placed a monetary value on the environmental impacts across its global operations and supply chain. The EP&L valued the environmental impacts, which included greenhouse gas emissions, water use and other impacts, at €145 million during the 2010 financial year. One of the most important findings, however, was that of the €145 million, only 6% was attributed to Puma's direct operations. The real hotspot was in Tier 4 of its supply chain, which represents raw material production such as cattle ranching for leather. In subsequent years, this finding turned Puma's attention to product design and material substitution, as well as improving transparency further up their supply chain. In 2012, to help assist this objective, Puma commissioned Trucost to conduct a product-level EP&L for a number of its key apparel and footwear products. The product EP&L places a monetary value on the environmental impacts across the entire value chain of a given product. In this sense, it is a bottom-up approach using granular data sets that allow comparisons to be made across a particular product portfolio. This slide shows the results for two of the products analysed. As you can see, we were able to value the natural capital impacts and dependencies across the entire value chain of the product, including the customer use and disposal phases. Using the product EP&L results, Puma were able to identify opportunities to reduce the impact of their products. They had released a biodegradable in-cycle range of shoes and t-shirts, and using the EP&L framework, were able to calculate the natural capital savings of this initiative. The organic cotton t-shirt and the recycled polyester shoes, for instance, achieved a 31% reduction in environmental costs compared to their conventional counterparts, as displayed here. In essence, Puma now have a materials library that can be used for the product design team to select the most sustainable solution for their products. The in-cycle cotton t-shirt, the top left-hand label here, has a higher cost associated with water consumption because it uses organic cotton that requires more land and more irrigation than conventional cotton. Overall, however, the in-cycle offering is more sustainable, and the EP&L approach can be used to justify this selection. Puma were also able to communicate these savings to their customers using product labels like these highlighted here. Again, this demonstrates the benefit of natural capital accounting in that it converts everything into a common metric that can be readily understood by a number of different stakeholders.
Excellent. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Puma work, so hopefully by us looking at how it's been moved on from an enterprise-wide EP&L to then look at product-specific EP&L shows a transition of how this is an extremely valuable tool in terms of product development. So the final slide, and in summary, and I promise I'll keep it short, I want to reflect on what we're seeing today and what we believe the future will look like in terms of natural capital accounting. What we see today is many companies undertaking ad hoc natural capital accounting evaluation exercises, either looking at specific parts of the business, the supply chain, a product, or particularly high risk impact area for them and their business. There's also an increasing amount of momentum growing to develop standardized approaches, which will facilitate a greater take-up of natural capital accounting at a corporate investor and sovereign country level. So we see a future where natural capital accounting will be fully embedded alongside financial accounting. With this alignment and being presented in comparable financial metrics, it will support all elements of business decision making, from procurement to operational management, product development and strategic decisions, business direction. I'd like, before I sum up at the end, to thank you all for staying with us, remaining such a captive audience throughout. We've had some really good questions coming through, and I hope that they continue to come through as we engage with the last part of our webinar, which will be the Q&A Quiz the Experts. We hope that the content has been both insightful, informative, and we now look forward to receiving those further questions and answering those that have already been submitted. I'll now hand you back over to Victoria at 2 Degrees to take over as question master. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, Richie and Stephen, for your very informative presentation. So as you say, there's lots of questions coming in, so I'll just kick off straight away. So the first one is, in your experience, what is the key driver for companies to manage their environmental impact? Is it stakeholder expectations or cost-driven or something else?
Yeah, thank you. I'll take this, Steve. I think based on the way we put the presentation together, we really have focused on the drivers, and those drivers we see are communication, risk management and product development led. So by communication, that's more of a reporting driver, as mentioned in the question. For risk management, it's all about understanding cost and managing risks within the supply chain or other areas of the value chain. And for product development, it's around optimizing your portfolio in line with sustainable choices. So in the Puma example is a really good case of where they understood a risk. That was in the tier 4 raw material production. And they mitigated that risk by trying to substitute less sustainable materials for more sustainable ones. So you saw in the example where they switched from conventional cotton to organic cotton, or from leather to recycled polyester. So I think those are the key drivers, and I think the case studies that we've selected today really address each of those three important strands. Anything you want to add, Richie?
It's Richie here. Just to add, look at the question. I think all environmental projects, all of the work we do is driven around some sort of cost, whether it's mitigating a risk, which is a potential environmental cost, whether it's communicating to stakeholders to keep the cost of capital low, whether it's looking at optimizing products to ensure future revenues or to protect your supply chain. So I think cost is always a driver. It manifests itself in different ways, and a lot of the work we do, as outlined by Steve, in different areas is all related to cost. So to answer your question, it always comes back to cost and profitability.
Thank you. The next question is, how can I learn more about the process of natural capital accounting? Do you offer any training opportunities?
So in response to your question, I think there's a lot of literature around the subject. You can visit the number of outlets, our website, for example, or the work being produced by TEEB would be a really good starting point for anyone wanting to learn more about natural capital accounting. I think in terms of training opportunities, there are some around. It's sometimes difficult to find specific modules that are dedicated to environmental valuation, but they are growing in numbers these days. And we'd be happy if we would like to take this offline. We'd be happy to recommend some sort of key sources for this type of information. Anything you guys would like to add?
Yeah, I think there are many sources that you can look in. So some of the reports we have published are very good methodological sections to which you can refer. You can also look at other institutions that are active in the space. Some of them being, for example, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which have developed publicly available guides around valuing ecosystem services. So as Steve mentioned, we can continue this conversation offline if you want more resources to learn about this.
Great, thank you. So next up, what are some of the variables for which data collection is most challenging? Are the final analysis and recommendations weighted by the variables' individual levels of uncertainty?
So, this is Julie here. So some of the variables for which data collection is most challenging. So first of all, I would say it depends on the company, it depends on the size of the company, it depends on the industry in which the company operates. Historically, some data points have been collected more than other, and the obvious example is carbon, because more focus has been put on it, just in terms of regulation, for example. Other indicators have received, some attention in specific industries, like, air pollutants, but others have received, less attention, like land and water pollutants, although I would have to substantiate that because in some key industries, like the chemical industry, there are some reporting requirements around the use and disposal of certain chemicals used in the process and products. Something else to consider is the supply chain stage that you're looking at. It's easier to collect operational data or data from suppliers with whom you have very good relationship. But the further up or down the supply chain you go, the more you have to rely on modeled data and secondary data. And this brings us to, the question of uncertainty. And here I would have to say that, the choice is not about measuring and valuing natural capital and valuation versus perfect information. The choice here is about valuing natural capital versus just having a simple intuition or gut feeling. So it's not an exact science. It's always going to be based upon assumptions, and we have to recognize that and be very transparent. But it's the order of magnitude and the direction of change that matters more than the decimal number, that you calculate. And there are several ways, to start to assess this, and I'm thinking about sensitivity models, for example, so running the analysis using different assumptions and seeing which assumption has the most material effect on the overall results, and focusing more time on refining those specific assumptions rather than spending time on something that's not going to be relevant. So the key message is there's always going to be some uncertainty. We need to recognize it, we need to embrace it, and we need to mitigate it using some analysis techniques like sensitivity analysis.
Excellent.
Great, thank you. Next up, do you account for the inherent limitations of data tools, such as LCAs and EPDs, within your analyses?
So I guess here it would be more or less the same, answer that I provided to the previous question. Obviously, we do rely on life cycle analysis as a source of secondary data when we cannot collect primary data. When we can collect primary data, we always, try to integrate them as much as possible. So some inherent limitation of LCA factors are still, present in our analysis. However, we go one step further than life cycle analysis. And for example, our valuations regionalize the results. Something which traditional life cycle analysis has typically struggled to do. Obviously, there are some techniques to do so, but they're not very well developed. They're challenged. So natural capital valuation adds this extra layer of analysis that can help to refine and translate into more businessy terms the result of a traditional life cycle analysis.
And I would just add to that one of the key things is we don't accept one data point in isolation. The key challenge as researchers is to really to triangulate your sources. So when you have an LCA study or an EPD, you triangulate it with other studies to make sure that you are happy with the assumptions that have been made and how that data point has been derived. So in everything we do, we try to provide some idea of the quality of disclosure. And if we're not happy with it, then we're very sort of transparent about the limitations, and that's the key thing when you're addressing these types of concerns in any study.
Thank you very much. What is the average cost of 1 meter cubed of interface carpet compared to the natural capital value?
So hello, this is Alice. So the average price, so here we talk about the market price of carpet per square meter was around $20 per square meter. And so if we compare this to the natural capital cost that we have calculated, the natural capital cost represents around 8% of this market price. So this enables to see what if we were to integrate these externalities within the profit of the company, this would have a significant impact.
And following on from this, what is the current natural capital cost per ton of carbon in the US?
Well, I believe that the US government released a social cost of carbon approximately 1 year ago. So for the US, and it was situated around $50 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so it would vary a little bit based on the assumptions that you would take. And so this $50 per ton was the average value. And so if we compare this to global averages, there are many studies which calculate social cost of carbon. There are more than 200 studies who undertook this calculation of the social cost of carbon, which varies a lot based on the assumptions such as the climate change model that you will embed in your calculation, such as the discount rate as well. But to compare this $50 to another study, there's of course the study that has been undertaken by Stern, which calculates the social cost of carbon around $120 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent.
Thank you. So what are some of the tools that could help small firms with limited resources to include natural cost accounting into decision making?
That's a good question. I think there's one very good resource that's aimed at providing some of the tools and insights and practical case studies. It's a Natural Capital Hub. It's a US-based platform to help organizations start to address some of these complex decisions on their own. I think it's quid pro quo with the fact that if it's a small organization, it tends to be a less complex undertaking. And I think in lots of cases, the first step can be taken by accessing these types of platforms. Other than that, it's a collection of information that's out there, as we've already mentioned, on things like our website. There's lots of reports that show how you go about starting that process and what methodologies might be used behind the analysis themselves. But I think the main thing would be you'd need to have a good hand on your own data if you're going to start the process, and then look at what methodologies on things like the Natural Capital Hub are available. Others?
Yeah, I have to add to this that there's different levels of analysis. You don't have to do a full profit and loss account based on primary data and engage with your suppliers right away. An informative first step, is to do the analysis at a very high level, a little bit like a screening life cycle analysis for those of you who are familiar with it, using only modeled data. So this will significantly, fasten the process and decrease the amount of resources that you would need to invest in such an analysis. So I would recommend, an incremental approach, starting high level and then drilling down into the specific areas that are material, step by step.
Thank you. So for the companies you have worked with, have the cost and savings forecast affected the company's ability to get financing for these activities?
Good question. I think within the 6 we already outlined, one of those you can directly look at, the Utilix example. It absolutely affected them getting financing for activities. It was part of the underpinning work, the underpinning business case for that financing. I think more broadly, what we're seeing is absolutely with the recent spate around green bonds being issued, we're absolutely seeing that companies, some of which we've worked with, and we've seen big names like Unilever, Skanska, GDF Suez raise significant amounts in the open market, in the bond market, focused around the financing of transitioning to a sustainable company. So to underpin the raising of that capital, they need to use this type of work, the cost and savings and risk of environment, to try and access that capital and raise money in the open market. So in the work we've done, we've seen it, and I think we see it more broadly out there in the space.
One other thing I guess I would add to that is more anecdotally is that I think within companies that natural capital valuation actually facilitates conversations between departments. So, for example, sustainability departments able to demonstrate the benefit of initiatives to therefore secure more funding from central reserves of funding. So actually being able to sort of communicate environmental issues in a financial or a more monetarized way actually allows those conversations to happen with procurement, with finance teams, so with executive level employees. So I think that's another way or another thing we've seen in some of the work we've been doing.
Great, thank you. So how much of your time is improving the tool and internally discussing the overall analytical process versus working on specific projects or with clients?
Thanks, I'll take that one. I think that's quite a difficult question to quantify in precise terms, but I think, and generally speaking, the methodologies are continually improving, and it's more. They don't necessarily that doesn't necessarily happen in isolation of products. So what we tend to have is quite innovative projects which are developing and advancing methodologies, and what happens is that will then feed into our general processes. So we have a constant cycle of development, and it's being driven by what people are asking for in the market. So we don't tend to stay sort of stagnant in terms of the way we approach things. We're looking for new avenues, new ways to communicate, new ways to expand natural capital valuation techniques. And the other thing, just to add, is that we always have an annual review of methodologies, and we actually have support from an academic advisory panel. And actually, outside of that, we quite routinely engage with third parties to kind of to open up the conversation and ensure that we are approaching things in a robust and accurate way. So difficult to quantify, but I think it's an ongoing thing, and I know certainly a lot of my time is about identifying new ways identify new ways to expand the application of valuation.
Great, thank you. So does the biodegradable T-shirt by Puma last as long as the conventional T-shirt?
Yes. It's assumed to have a 2-year useful life, the same as the conventional shirt. So that was the assumption that went into this project.
Easy answer.
Yeah.
So another question, where could we obtain a list of listed companies that have published EP and L reports?
Question? Yeah, good question. I think one area I mentioned earlier on, the Natural Capital Hub, has a list of 25 plus US companies that have done EP&Ls, so that's a good starting point. I wouldn't say there's a comprehensive global list, but that's a good starting point for US companies. And I think if you were to look through Truecost's website, you'd probably close the circle and come up with the majority of the other EP&Ls that have been delivered. But again, happy to kind of, if you want to email me, I can kind of send you links to where you might find a list of those EP&Ls.
Great. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So what consideration do you make for location-specific impacts like air pollution?
Well, air pollution is a good example because it is indeed highly location-specific. And so in terms of scope, our valuation will cover the damage generated on crops, on forests, on health, and on buildings as well. And so the magnitude of the valuation will depend on the country vulnerability against environmental change. And so our methodology is country specific, and so it will be lower or higher amongst countries based on the vulnerability to environmental change. And so, for example, if we take the example of crops won't have the same sensitivity against air pollution concentration increase. And so we do account for the types of crops which are within each country in order to be able to quantify and to give an order of magnitude which takes into account this sensitivity. And so, yeah, this was for the example of air pollution, but for example, if we think about water valuation, it will also be country specific, but it can also be more location specific, and so we can build a valuation at a river basin level. And in this case, one of the main driver of the magnitude of the valuation will be water scarcity. And so the more water scarcity is important. So if you have a low availability of water within one river basin, the marginal damage cost of abstracting 1 cubic meter of water within this river basin will be much higher compared to another river basin where water is abundant.
Thank you. And to finish off, what about human or social capital?
Yes, good question. Of course, I think the focus of today's presentation has been around natural capital valuation, which is a particular sort of focus area for Trucost. But we recognise that it's prudent not to ignore the other important forms of capital, those being social and human. And we do partner with a number of organisations to help quantify those parts of the process and offer actually a more holistic overview of a company's impact on the environment and society at large. So we recognise that natural capital is one component of the conversation that needs to be had, and we look to work with partners to sort of fill the remaining gaps.
Great. I think that's all we've got time for, but it's been a really great webinar, and I'd really like to thank the presenters and the panelists, Richie, Stephen, Julie and Alice, for performing this webinar. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us. So the recording of the webinar and presentation, the recording of the webinar will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform. For any questions that you didn't quite get time to answer, you can post your discussions on the 2 Degrees platform. I hope you found today informative and enjoyable. If you're interested in the water side of things, we've got a webinar coming up on a decade of reflections on corporate water management, which is on Tuesday the 24th of June. More details of this can be found on the 2 Degrees platform. So thank you, and I hope to speak to you all soon.